This is the I Read Comic Books podcast, and I am your host for this week's episode, Paul Jasley, filling in for Mike Rapin. But of course, I am not alone. I am joined once again by the two Kates of the IRCB, Kate Lamphere.
Hello.
And Kate Scotchless.
Hello.
I think last time I hosted, it was this same group here, so it's good to have the gang back together. After the month off, we have to see if I remember how to do any of this, but so far so good, right? One thing I did not forget, though, was the two questions I'm legally obligated to ask at the beginning of every episode. How have you been, and how have comic books been? Let's start with you, Kate Lamphere.
I've been good. I'm still in my gardening phase, middle of summer. My tomatoes are coming out. My cherry tomatoes are not cherry tomatoes. That's a surprise. They're quite large. Okay. But I have also been reading quite a few comics. I most recently read Batman Volume 1, Their Dark Designs. This is the arc by James Tynion IV for the writer, and then the artists are Tony S. Daniel and Danny Mickey. I read this for the Goodreads theme of the month for May, so I'm rather behind the theme for May was the first appearance in a Big Two book, and the character introduced in this book was the villain Punchline. And I want to thank Aaron in the Goodreads group for pointing that out, because I really enjoyed this book, and I'm glad that I had a reason to read it. I don't read a lot of Big Two books, but every time somebody recommends a specific one, I tend to enjoy it. So I'm glad that I read this. This book is about there's kind of this point in the Gotham history where Batman comes to a point where things are starting to change. He's starting to fund things as Bruce Wayne to try to improve Gotham. He's working with Catwoman. Alfred has died already by the time that the comic opens, so that was sad. But then in the events of this comic book, he's the Rogues Gallery, the Riddler, the Joker, and Penguin are all kind of morally gray characters, and they're not the main villains of the book, but they're in it. And I found that a really interesting dynamic. So I enjoyed that part of it, and then the art worked really well for me. And for this story, other than still the unrealistically tight costumes for the female characters, Catwoman, Harley Quinn was in this. But the attention to detail in the art and the textures work really well for this Batman, Their Dark Designs volume. And then there are some short comics in the rear matter by different artists, and I didn't realize that these were prequel stories until I was a few pages in, because I was like, hang on a second. When this book ends, Batman looks much different than the next story that comes up. I'm like, something happened here. This is not just an artist change. So I realized that these short stories at the end actually happened before the events of the book, and they kind of inform the decisions of all of the many characters in this book. So that was actually really nice, although I wish that it had said prequel before these stories.
Right.
And this volume 1 is not the end of the arc. I think that there are 3 or 4 volumes at this point. And like I said, I don't read a lot of Batman, so I'm not really sure that I'm going to continue, but if this sticks around in my head like it has been, maybe I'll just have to keep going.
Yeah, I remember liking that stuff when it came out. I mean, James Tynion is a really good Batman writer. And I liked in that volume, that story, having the Joker, the Penguin, Riddler, and Catwoman kind of joined together is a direct reference to the 1966 Batman movie with Adam West, because that's the United Underworld is the gang that comes together in that movie. So that was a little shout out to the nerds, I think, from Tynion for that one.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't know that.
What about you, Kate Scotchless? What have you been reading?
Well, I have started working on the IRCB reading challenge for this year. Getting a late start here, but I found myself in a reading rut, and I was like, I know what I can do about that. So I picked up The Arrival by Sean Tan from my local library, and this is the book nominated by Kate Lamphere here with us. Not this Kate. And I had no idea what it was. I didn't look it up or anything other than looking up the number to get it at the library. And I absolutely loved it. So this is from 2006, and it's all surrealist art, no words. which is interestingly, depending on what like media source you're looking at or awards forum, it's a children's picture book, a YA short story, or an OGN. Like no one can agree, which conveniently means he got so many awards for this in all these different categories. So, but it's about the immigrant experience, and in the back of the graphic novel, it goes into all the research he did and sources he looked into and stuff for this, and really explains why it feels so real and true while also being so fantastical and surrealist. And I love part of not having words in the comic is there's like a made up writing system in it, so that you're not writing the stuff, but it really gives that feel of like this character being dropped into this world where he doesn't speak the language, he doesn't read the writing, and he has to figure it all out, and and is exposed to these foods that both you and the character don't recognize because of course they're fantastical. And just kind of like the whole world is completely unique in that way, and I don't know, it's just the most beautiful art. And so in terms, yeah.
I was a little worried when I picked it.
It would be funny if I was like, Kate picked the worst book. No, I cannot imagine us disagreeing that deeply on a book. Like slight differences in taste sometimes of like, I liked it, you loved it, but I feel like we're similar enough that could never happen.
Yeah.
But
fair enough.
This got like a Hugo Award nominee, a Locus Award for Best Art Book. It got some Picture Book of the Year awards from Australia, which is where Sean Tan's from. It got a Aurelius Award for Best Young Adult Short Story. It got a bunch of awards I can't pronounce in Europe, and because they're in German and stuff like that. But yeah, just I'm not going to go through the whole list because there's so many, but very well earned. But I think that's funny that he fit all these different characters categories by being kind of ambiguous what we call something like this. And I don't think I know of another graphic novel that is no words. I can think of picture books like the one that's called Tuesday or something like that, the picture book that has like the frogs and stuff. It's another surrealist one, but it's very clearly marketed and designed as a children's book, whereas this is 132 page hardcover that no child could follow. Like maybe like a high school age kids, maybe pretty sophisticated middle schoolers, but I think below that you'd really be pushing a child's understanding. And it's very adult themes. I mean, it's about a man going to immigrating to send money back home to his family to support them, and then ultimately raise enough money to get them to hopefully come live with them, and that the isolation and loneliness and missing them and stuff, which is just not a kid's thing, but have you read this one, Paul?
I mean, I have not, but it's going to be on my list now.
Absolutely.
I kind of like, I love anyone that tries to experiment and do something, quote unquote silent comics without words, because like I think it's so hard to pull off, and it's done well. It's really remarkable, and usually it is just a short story. There's a handful of single issues I can think of that do it, but to have a whole book, especially a book with some pretty deep themes, like that seems pretty amazing. So yeah, this is definitely on my to read pile now.
What's nice about it getting all the awards and being on every like essential graphic novels you should read list is that your library will definitely have it, which is always nice for these expensive OGNs. Because it's like an awkwardly oversized book too.
Yeah. I'm definitely overdue for a trip down to the library, so that I'll have to keep an eye out for that next time I'm there.
Well, what did you read?
Great question. I read, finally, The Best of 2000 AD Volume 3. This came out a while ago. My shop didn't get it right when it came out, so I had to wait for it, and then I wanted to sit down and really enjoy it. I've talked about these collections on previous episodes. These are anthologies, collections of classic 2000 AD material. And obviously, like most people, I come to 2000 AD for Judge Dredd. And what's nice about these collections, they give you samples of the other non-Judge Dredd stories that 2000 AD has done over the years, and it's a really, really cool way to get that sort of like scope of what this anthology has meant over the years. So speaking of which, this volume includes a brand new Judge Dredd story written by Michael Carroll and Mark Sexton. It's about Judge Dredd uncovering a secret division of judges that has no, oversight, or operates outside the jurisdiction of the rest of the judge system. So about the secret history of Mega City 1 going on there, which is always kind of cool to see. The other non-Judge Dredd stories in it include Storming Heaven, which is a story by Gordon Rennie and Fraser Irving. And it's basically a psychedelic superhero story. Like, the main character is someone that takes so much LSD that he gains like superpowers, and he's trying to create this like, a world akin to heaven here on earth, where just everyone's at peace and everyone's, once they've accepted and transcended their own ego, they gain superpowers. It's a very trippy and psychedelic, which is perfect for Fraser Irving's artwork. It's like, it's all these bright colors and like, fantastical images. The story turns into something else, where there's a dark aspect of the main character who's essentially a superhero version, not superhero, basically a superpowered version of Charles Manson. Obviously, it's an analogy about the 60s, the Summer of Love and all that. So it was a really cool story. And it's nice. All the selections in this volume are all standalone stories. Unlike the previous volumes, had been like, the first volume of a story and you had to pick up the other collections to finish it. These are all standalone. So that one comes to a conclusion. Leviathan is a story by Ian Eddington and Disraeli. This one is really cool. And I think Kate Lamphere would appreciate this story. It's a murder mystery set on a massive Titanic-like ship that's been lost at sea for 20 years. It's great because it kind of examines the hierarchy of the class system on the boat, because you have the first class people are all, rich, established, landowning, wealthy people. And then as you get lower and lower in the ship to the steerage section, it's like a different class levels. And the detective who's investigating the murders has to transcend those worlds, so kind of get to look at like how that operates. There's a big twist when you find out exactly why the ship has been missing for 20 years, which gets pretty fantastical, but I think it's a really great story. And Disraeli's artwork is like this amazing black and white, but he'll sometimes use like dark backgrounds and then have like gray line work on top of it to make everything sort of pop off the page a little bit. It's a really, really striking image when he does that in this book. My favorite story in this collection is The Graveyard Shift. That's a classic Judge Dredd story written by John Wagner and Alan Grant, art by Ron Smith. I'd read this before, but it's fun to go back and reread it. It's basically one night in Mega City 1, and you get to see the sense of like what exactly happens when the judges are on patrol. There's block wars, juvie gang fights. There's a mutant invasion from the cursed earth that happens. A serial killer is on the loose. There's a moment toward the end of the story where there's a caption that says, on average, at this moment in Mega City 1, there are 24 armed robberies, 139 assaults, 5 murders, 230 traffic offenses, and 0.09 riots every minute. So this overwhelming scale of like what the judges deal with. And it's a perfect example of why I love the John Wagner and Alan Grant Judge Dredd stories. This story is so well paced. It's like, it starts off, it's like, oh, it's night Mega City 1. And then something else happens. And every chapter, almost every page, like something different is happening. And the story somehow feels like huge and crazy, but it's also just well paced and self-contained. It's just a really compelling way to write a story. And it also, examines the fact that all of the problems in Mega City 1 are usually caused by the judges themselves. They're never solving anything. They're just reacting to what's happening, and what's happening is usually their fault. But it does have one of my favorite Judge Dredd lines in it. There's a scene where one of the mega blocks is like burning down, so a bunch of other citizens bring out hot dogs on sticks to roast them over the burning building.
Savage.
That's what you do in Mega City 1, and then Judge Dredd rolls up and says, hey, you're blocking the street, got to get out of the street, guys. And this one citizen just says, oh, you can't tell me what to do, it's a free city. And Judge Dredd just says, yeah, you're free to do what you're told. And the guy like runs away. So it's pretty great. And I love classic Judge Dredd because it's very funny, but it's also very dark humor. It's great stuff. So yeah, if you want to read one great Judge Dredd story, that is The Graveyard Shift in this collection. So again, best of 2000 AD. This is the 3rd volume, and I'm loving every single one. So I don't know how many volumes I've planned. I think 6 in total, but man, everyone has been great so far. So
this actually does sound like something I might read. I haven't read. I don't think I've read any of these. Maybe one Judge Dredd book before on your recommendation.
Yeah.
So maybe this will be the second one.
Yeah, I mean, again, I like all the volumes, but I think this one is good because all the stories are standalone. It's not like you're getting the first part of a story, so you can enjoy all of these as they are. The Leviathan story is fantastic, and the artwork in the psychedelic superhero one is great too. So highly, highly recommended as always. Yeah, Kate, what else did you read this week?
I read 34 volumes of Attack on Titan. To be clear, since May. So this was not a recent complete read. But I recently finished it.
Nice.
This is by Hajime Asayama. I started reading this the day that the K-Manga app went up, which I think was May 9th. And then I finished the last volume just recently on August 4th. So this was a multi-month read for me. And I feel like I ran a marathon, or maybe I read a marathon. And it was similarly enjoyable. Like the beginning and the end was good, and that was about it. If you're not familiar with Attack on Titan, it starts with all of known humanity living inside of this giant walled city. And there are Titans on the outside, which are these giants that eat people for no discernible reason. And there's a single small military force trained to fight them properly, which, as you can imagine, is not enough. And and it's 34 volumes. So, of course, there's more to what these Titans are. And the biggest bad guy in the series is maybe not the Titans. Like, it goes kind of off the rails.
Okay.
And the covers for this series looked like it was going to be all about fighting, which I'm really not into. But I gave it a chance because, like, I opened up this K-Manga app. I started figuring out how, like, the payment system worked back in May. And this was the first or maybe the second, like, free daily read. And it gripped me enough that I just kept going. So... there are a whole lot of characters in this book once you get into it, and then there's political intrigue. I think that the main reason I stuck around is because there are 3 main characters, really, and their arcs do last the entire series. They are in, at least one of them is in most of the chapters. So I stuck around for them to find out what happens to them. Characters in this book do like actually die, like people get eaten. So I was like, maybe these guys aren't going to last. I have to read it. So there is much more to than just fighting in this story. Like there's a lot of mystery and good character arcs and everything. And I did enjoy this series quite a bit until around volume 20. And then again, there's 34 volumes of Attack on Titan. So the story just got much bigger very, very quickly, like over the course of like 2 chapters. And I wanted it to focus on those 3 main characters. That's why I was reading it. But the final volume did leave me in tears, so it is like a cathartic ending. I still cared about the characters by the end. And Isayama, the creator, does a really good job at doing like these full page or full spread illustrations, which you can see a few of on the covers, like these colored versions of those same spreads. So like there are sometimes it gets bogged down in its own story. There are enough like wow moments in each volume that it's like it keeps me going. So I think I'm glad that I read Attack on Titan. But
is that the complete series?
Yes, 34 volumes.
Okay.
There are like a couple of like offshoot series, like there's like a prequel series, and there's like a Girls' Day Out series that I might read. And there's like an anthology from different creators where like they're either in canon stories or they are like what if stories. And I got that out from the library, but I haven't read it yet. Gotcha. So yeah, if you like long character arcs with like a whole lot going on, this is a good book, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend it if you're really not into fighty comics or political intrigue. But yeah, I finished it, so
nice. Yeah, I've heard of it, but I had no idea what it was about, so thanks for explaining it to me.
Yeah, I might read some of these offshoot series still. Like I still
cool.
Still like
just out of curiosity, you said you're reading this on an app. What are you like reading these on your phone?
I'm reading them. I've got like a little tablet. It's not that much bigger than my phone, but it's like the size of a book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Nice.
the K manga app, it's Kodansha's app that they put out beginning of the summer. So
Nice.
although I've noticed that Hoopla is also carrying some manga now. It's a lot of like
Yes, they
Tokyo
are.
Pop, so
Oh,
that's very exciting.
interesting.
Comixology Unlimited also has more and more manga now.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I've been into manga for a while, but this is really taking me out. Like I'm finding some weird stuff.
Nice.
It's not hard to find weird stuff in manga.
Yeah.
It's
Right. Yeah.
Well, how about you, Paul? Did you read anything else this week?
One last thing I wanted to mention, because I think it's a really cool series I haven't talked about on the show. There's a new sci-fi anthology series that Oni Press is putting out called Xino, Xino. And I read the second issue of that this week. It's really cool. Like, again, I kind of just like when publishers are experimenting with anthology stuff, because I've already talked about 2000 AD. That comic's been around for over 45 years. And like, here's another like example of a publisher trying to do an anthology. And it is very sci-fi themed. Every story is either set in an alternate universe or it's almost like a Black Mirror kind of like vibe to
Yeah.
it. Some of the stories. The second volume or second issue has a story from David Maria Lapham, who did, Dave Lapham did Stray Bullets, like a famous indie series. Kind of cool to see him do, a color sci-fi type short story. There's another story by Alex Segura and Zander Cannon, which is kind of like this sci-fi, obviously sci-fi, but fantasy story about a woman tracking down this powerful monster that destroyed her planet and coming to terms with that. There's a really great story about a man who works for a company and he died on the job and then he's brought back to life, and then like he's going to the owner of the company. He's like, well, I did all this work, should I get a raise? He's like, you want a raise? We brought you back to life. How dare you ask for a raise?
You've been
Isn't bringing back
raised.
to life enough? Right. So kind of a dark, that's the very sort of Black Mirror type story. And that was written by Hagel Pavelski, illustrated by Carson Thorne. That's a fun little short story. Well, quote unquote fun little short story.
Yeah.
But it's cool. And like, I like this stuff because I get to see artwork from artists I'm not familiar with. There's a story about an alien observing early humans, cavemen, and reporting back to their home world about it and stuff. Kind of get a sense of what is that Chariot of the Gods type story where like aliens helped develop humanity and stuff. Kind of a riff on that. It's written by Francois Vigneault and illustrated by Artyom Trakhanov, and the artwork is incredible. I never heard of this artist before, so it's kind of cool to see stuff like that from an anthology. It's one of the reasons I like buying these kind of comics. I want to support anthologies because I know they're usually not very successful, especially in the US market.
Yeah.
So if you want some sci-fi stuff, I think Xino, cool series. I'm assuming it's going to be collected at some point, but the third issue's out soon. So it's easy to catch up on if you're curious. So that's what I read.
It does sound cool.
That being said, that's the comics that we read. What about comics we're excited to read? Let's take a look at what's on the top of our pile. And let's go back to you, Kate Lamphere. What's on the top of your pile for this week?
Yeah, I actually heard about this comic on Instagram. So it's been on my radar for a couple of months now. It's coming out on Wednesday, August 8th. This is called Mother Nature. This is by the actor Jamie Lee Curtis and the artist. Oh, and there's also a second writer, Russell Goldman, and then the art is by Carl Stevens. And from what I can find, this was a screenplay first, which might explain how Jamie Lee Curtis got involved. But I don't know. I haven't really read that much into this. How this came about. But there is a character who looks like Jamie Lee Curtis in the previews pages. So like she's definitely like super involved with this. This isn't just a splash author line or something,
Yeah.
In this comic, a teen girl's dad dies while working for an oil giant company. She starts digging into his mysterious death and uncovers something nefarious. And based on like the title, Mother Nature, and the villain being an oil giant, like I have a very strong suspicion that this is going to be like a commentary on climate change, which is largely like I feel like that is supported by this trailer that I found on YouTube for this. You can just Google it or go to YouTube and find it, Mother Nature comic. But there's also like something supernatural going on in this book. And then there's like some of the art is suggestive of like horror comics, like in like an homage kind of way. So there's just like there's a number of intriguing things happening with this book. So I can't let this one slip by.
No, that sounds cool. I had not heard of this. I guess I'm not getting those targeted ads on Instagram. So, surprisingly. What about you, Kate? What are you excited for this week?
I just picked up from my local library Parachute Kids by Betty C. Tang. It's a middle grade OGN that came out last April. And it's a story about three siblings living on their own as undocumented new immigrants, inspired by the author's own childhood as a parachute kid. So, someone who knows what they're writing about, right? And so, it is fiction, but it mirrors their experiences to a degree. So, three kids go to America for a vacation with their family, and they have this fun vacation, and then their parents are like, oh, surprise, we're going back to Taiwan and you guys aren't.
Wow.
And you need to figure out going to school and learning the new language and making friends and running a household together, because you're going to have a better life here, kind of thing. And so it goes into kind of the conflict between the brother and sister, who are the older two, and their stress and loneliness, but also has humor and lighter moments and stuff. It is middle grade, so it's not like bleak. But the kids kind of get tangled in a web of bad choices, and tensions escalate, and that becomes the main conflict of like, can our main character, the sister, keep her family together and make this work, And it came highly recommended by my friend who's a middle school librarian. She's like, you have to read this. And I'm like, okay. So I've been waiting for a while with that on hold, and my time has come.
Nice.
That's exciting.
How about you, Paul?
Well, on a very different topic. Well, before I get to my pick, we have people hanging out with us, listening on Discord and listening to the show right now. Danny is doing the proof listening for this episode, and he's excited for the Enfield Gang Massacre #1. So am I. That's a new comic from Chris Condon and Jacob Phillips, the team behind That Texas Blood. It's an old Western story. Cannot wait for it. So thanks for reminding me that's coming out this week, Danny. And then Hugh is listening along with us. He's excited for Immortal X-Men #14. I guess since Mike's not here, we have to have one obligatory X-Men reference. So there we go. Thank you, Hugh. As for my pick, I'm excited because I just picked up from the shop this past weekend, Werewolf Jones and Sons Deluxe Summer Fun Annual. The latest chapter of the ongoing Meg and Mog series that I know Mike's talked about. I think Tia's mentioned on the show. It's written by Simon Hanselman and Josh Pettinger. I think it's the first time Hanselman has had someone else write stories for one of their comics, so it's kind of interesting to see another author involved. And it's apparently an homage to British comics, because I guess in Britain, publishers would put out like big or hardcover anthology collections for the summer. So that's why it's the Summer Fun Annual. So it's an homage to that. But of course, if you're familiar with Werewolf Jones and his sons, there's going to be a lot of depravity. This is certainly not a comic for kids. Werewolf Jones is going to, known for being a notorious drug user, a terrible father, sex addict, and basically the most terrible human being imaginable. Also werewolf, and obviously implied by the name. So these comics are super fun. They're super crude. There's kind of a nice little escape to have some of this kind of humor every now and again. I really like the Megan Mogg stuff. So I was excited to see this in my box when I picked it up at the shop. So there we go. That's what I'm reading. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we have a topic for this episode. We're going to be talking about some of our favorite nonfiction comics, specifically nonfiction comics that are dealing with war or conflict. So we got a whole list here. I have the perfect guest to talk about these kind of comics. So we'll be right back with that topic. Welcome back to the show. As I said, we have a very specific topic for today's episode. I know Kate and I all love to read nonfiction comics, autobiographical type comics, nonfiction comics. And, we were kind of thinking about a way to focus that instead of just talking about that in general. But we kind of realized there's a lot of them that we've read over the years that kind of stuck with us that involved war or conflict. So maybe not the most uplifting topic, but I think what's interesting is that comics, specifically nonfiction comics or autobiographical comics, are a great way to tackle that type of story. Because I think in a lot of ways, comics feel a lot more personal. If someone's writing about their own experience through conflict, or someone's writing illustrating a story, it's more striking than just reading something on the page in text, I think. So that's kind of why I think these types of stories, maybe I gravitate toward these kind of nonfiction comics in general, because I think they're a great way to tackle some difficult subjects, that may not be easy to articulate. So we have a whole list here. We each listed some of our favorites. So I guess we'll just start. Somebody wants to jump in and mention one that stuck out to them and why they picked it.
I mean, I personally just went through the ones I read in the last couple of weeks. I feel like you can't talk about this topic without mentioning Mouse by Art Spiegelman, because that's like the quintessential example of this genre.
Yeah.
But at the same time, after reading a bunch of new ones, I was not about to revisit Mouse. I needed something cheerful.
That's a heavy read, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like for me, part of what makes them so powerful is the combination of the art with the story, and that I also read nonfiction books, not infrequently, and that part is, I feel like, why I get so much more of an emotional kick in the face from these, because when you look at books like I read a bunch of Joe Sacco's books, like Palestine and Footnotes in Gaza, these past few weeks, and his art is often like what would be the big money shot for a conflict photojournalist, right? Like if they were there, it's the perfect composition and image to drive home what's happening. But of course, those photos, for Footnotes in Gaza, this is about some stuff that war crimes that happened in the 50s. So in 1956. So those photos don't exist. And for Palestine, it's like those photos, this was in 1991, 1992, those photos might exist, but he's going around talking to all these different people about just the day-to-day injustices. Like, I was sitting in my home and a bullet came through the wall and my son got shot. And there's no photograph of that, and of the two parents both crouched over this dying boy, right? But you get that image through the comic, and that, I feel like, is what makes them so much more powerful to me than just if it were just writing.
Right.
Obviously, for both of those books, big content warnings for like on-page gore, assault, war crimes, horrible injustices. Like they are heavy reads.
Yeah, I think we could have a blanket content warning for all the books we're discussing.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they're dealing with violence. Sometimes it's graphic. Sometimes there's self-harm. So, obviously keep that in mind if you're checking these books out. So I'm glad you brought up the idea of journalism, though, because I think that's something that the idea of comic book journalism or graphic novel journalism, I think, is more a relatively new idea. But again, I think it really works in certain circumstances. Because one of the books I thought of right away was Rolling Blackouts, Dispatches from Turkey, Syria, and Iraq by Sarah Glidden. And that really is a book that's about the refugee crisis as a result of the invasion of Iraq. But it's also a story or a book about how journalists can cover that story objectively. And it is objective journalism possible. So on one hand, it is a story about the results or consequences of violence and war, but it's also this meditation on like what actually journalism is. And to have a cartoonist like Sarah Glidden, whose artwork looks very simple, but is actually like a great way to examine that, because, you're just reading the story, because the artwork is very it's like watercolor kind of colors, and it's very simple line work. So you let your guard down a little bit almost, and to have a very heavy subject and a very deep subject being discussed in that way really makes the book engaging. I think that's a tremendous book. I think I've mentioned on the show before. So that's a good example of this type of nonfiction journalism way of explaining these issues.
I feel like with Sarah Glidden's book, because it's simple, and occasionally in her book, How to Understand Israel in 60 Days or Less, you actually get panels where other people are like trying to talk to her while she's like journaling. And it kind of gives me the sense of like she was creating this panel at that moment, because these are, it's not like digital art. Like she didn't like sit down at a computer afterwards and like do these on the computer. Like she was potentially doing these while she was on the move, and it kind of lends that kind of like in the moment feel to it.
Joe Sacco actually has a whole graphic novel called Journalism, and I'm interested in reading it now that I've read all these. I also read The Fixer by him this week, which additional extra content warning for sexual assault in that one, but which is about one specific individual in Bosnia, kind of during and after the Bosnian War, and he's works as a fixer, and it jumps all over around in time, but it's very much like self-insert of Joe's relationship with this man and his growing understanding of who he is that changes pretty dramatically over time, of him being this, good guy to work with versus this like very unreliable narrator that made up basically half the stuff he told him or more.
Interesting.
About his experiences fighting in the war.
Yeah.
And how that is actually a pretty solid reflection of how so much of the information about the Bosnian conflict is, because there was no single good authority on any of this. And in fact, basically a bunch of warlords. So it's interesting. And I think that's when you're talking about doing the art in the at the same time, Joe Sacco very much, because he's including himself, also includes that he's always going around with a photographer who's taking pictures for him, who then he's using those as references for his art when he, goes home and draws everything.
Gotcha.
That's cool.
Which I think is an interesting process, but also interesting that he puts the photographer in the comic with him as he's sitting there interviewing people. He's sitting there with the translator and with the photographer and stuff. And he's also snapping some of his own photos, but kind of relying on someone else to do broad shots of like buildings and streets and stuff like that, which I appreciate getting that sense of how this was put together. And also that included is that also the actual sources when he's talking about specific facts and stats and stuff like that, like X number of houses were demolished in this year. All those sources are provided at the back, which I feel like gives more credence to the nonfiction journalism aspect of all of this, right? Of like, we're not just making stuff up. We're not just telling individual stories. But I haven't read anything about the Syrian conflict. The closest I read was Invisible Wounds, Interviews with American Vets, which is about veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq. And it's interviewing them all once they're done with their service. And serious content warning for suicide and addiction, as those are major issues facing veterans and do come up in this. But this is by Jess Rolfeson, and basically is a series of these short interviews with these different people about what it was like being overseas, and then what happened when they came home and their experiences after the fact. Which, spoiler, it's not cheerful. Most of them do not go on to have great lives. Because war messes you up. And our VA does not do a great job helping people with the mental health challenges and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Right.
But I, again, feel like the art showing these people talking in their experiences really creates a better connection to them than I would if I was just reading stories,
Right.
In terms of the Syrian conflict, I read Hakim's Odyssey by Fabian Toulme, volume 1, and then I read volume 2 recently, and there's going to be a volume 3. And I read some of the rear matter in volume 2 about how Toulme, like, he knows how big this series is, but he didn't want to leave anything out because the book is about him interviewing a man named Hakim about his journey from to escape Syria and to finally find a place to settle down. And Toulme didn't want to leave out any part of this journey because so much we hear about like the immigrant experience of this is where they left and this is where they ended up, and it like kind of skips everything in the middle.
Right.
So volume 1 was called From Syria to Turkey, and it shows like Hakim's life was like he was professionally successful. He was a business owner. He had this big extended family, his parents, aunts and uncles, cousins. And it was like their neighbors were family too, basically. But once the conflict starts, it shows like all of these things getting destroyed and all of these people having to leave. And eventually Hakim does too. So then volume 2 is Turkey to Greece, and it shows him like he's found a wife along the way and has a kid, and like they get split up. And and it shows him actually like doing an ocean crossing in a raft. So that was like, oh my god. And then volume 3 is going to be from Macedonia to France, and then I think France is where they settle down, because I'm pretty sure that that's where Toulme is interviewing him at. So I think that might be the last one. But this is like a huge, Hakim's Odyssey is the right title for this book because it's huge.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of also reminds me of Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is again.
Oh, I love that series.
It's such a good book, and it's a way of, for Marjane to like share her experience as being a young kid living through the Islamic Revolution in Iran in the early 80s. But again, it's like you get a deeper understanding of what it's actually like on the ground and that stuff. You know what I mean? Because the idea of that revolution or idea of like a conflict, it's almost abstract. But when you have a very focused sort of personal take on it, especially if it's an autobiographical memoir like Persepolis, it makes it feel more real. It makes you appreciate or understand the sacrifices that people are going through. Because I mean, that story is about her and her family moving from Iran, having to go to is it Austria that they end up in, or I don't remember exactly. Sorry.
Yeah.
And she discovers punk rock. So it's not just about the conflict in Iran. It's about her growing up as a person and how that shaped her experience, and like wanting to rebel in her own way while this Islamic revolution is happening in Iran. So that's another, that kind of came to mind as another example of that, a very personal, story.
Have you guys read any about more recent conflicts? Like obviously some of these are ongoing, like the issues with Syria, but like I picked up one called 83 Days in Mariupol, a war diary that's about the first 83 days of the Ukraine war by Don Brown. Wow. And I was surprised that something like this is out already.
Yeah.
But also, I don't want to say I didn't like it because it is interesting, but like it's all, instead of interviewing individual people, it's taken from news stories, and you get the actual like titles of everything he drew from in the back. But it feels very cobbled together because of that. And I'm wondering if that's just like pretty standard for the things that come out like really recent to these things, because it does feel very like cobbled together, but that's because he's using direct quotes from people he never met.
Right.
And they're being interviewed by different media sources to go through kind of what happens in the first 83 days in the city of Mariupol, which, if you remember, was the whole thing with people being barricaded in the steel plant, and then it gets, attacked. Right. And it was really, really ugly, and all the content warnings.
Yeah, that's
for everything that goes horrible in war zones.
I mean, that is really interesting. I feel like to have that sort of immediate response to something that's so currently ongoing, the war in Ukraine. So that's pretty amazing. You're able to get a comic out and have it. I'm sure, over the next few years, we'll have more and more of those types of stories coming out from that. Yeah, that's interesting. It
almost feels like a different type of book because of the recency. I feel like the recency is important, but at the same time, it doesn't give you the depth and breadth that you get with these retrospective comics that come out after the fact, or when they get to people once they're in a safe area and are able to talk to them more, or like Joe Sacco when he's writing about the Gaza Strip in '56. So he's just interviewing all these old people about that survived these atrocities is probably the right word, just where people came in and got slaughtered in their village, and I feel like it's the immediacy probably helps with accuracy, but also detracts from the kind of broader scope and feel for it,
Yeah. That immediacy is kind of fascinating to me, because you're reacting to it in real time in a way. And it makes me wonder if, because, nowadays there's so much information, we can get immediate updates of what's happening in Ukraine via social media, on Twitter, X.
People were live streaming it on TikTok. Yeah, it would not talk about immediate.
And it's like, it's almost to the point where you're getting so much information, it's hard to parse it. So, having someone step back and be able to kind of do a comic, that actually takes more time than just, making a video and posting it. So you're almost getting a more... I don't want to say more realistic or a curated look at something versus just getting a dump of information.
Yeah.
So A book that more recently came out that I kind of thought of, it's not about any specific conflict, but it's Save It for Later by Nate Powell. The full title, Save It for Later, Promises, Protests, and Parenthood. Nate Powell is the artist who worked with John Lewis on the March books, so you've probably seen his artwork
Wow.
before.
Oh, okay.
And he does a lot of sort of like almost like comic essays about contemporary politics in America. He's done, and that's what this book is. It's a collection of short, essentially graphic essays about protests, the necessary need for protests in this day and age. He takes his daughter to these like the pro-women marches that were happening right after the 2016 election. He's kind of teaching his child, here's the proper way to respond to these things. You can't just sit back. You have to do something. We can protest. That's what we're here to do. It also deals, he's writing this book during the pandemic, so that becomes part of it too. So it's a very immediate sort of stuff. And even though it's not about any specific one conflict, it's a very deep dive into the roots of contemporary politics in America and why they're so divisive right now. And it's amazing to see someone be able to do that visually in a comic. You know what I mean? So he did another book called Any Empire, which also stood out to me, which is basically an examination of how G.I. Joe infiltrated America's, young boys at the time and kind of trained them to be soldiers. The idea of like the sort of where not, I don't say brainwashing, but just, the idea of how that type of idea of conflict became permeated pop culture in the early 80s. And if you're a young kid playing with G.I. Joes, like that becomes all you know and understand. So that was another example of not specific conflict, but a way of examining the roots of violence in a visual graphic, storytelling.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. I'm adding that one to my TBR.
yeah everything I've read by Nate Powell is great. So again, it's journalistic, it's essays, it's opinion, but done graphically. Great stuff. And I also want to like mention a book. I know it's on your list, Kate, Lamphere. We got to talk about Kent State by Durf Backdurf, because you want to talk about a book that's deeply researched. That it's an overwhelming book because of the subject matter, the massacre at Kent State in 1970, but it's also, or 71, right? 70. And it's also just so deeply researched that it's like, it feels like you're actually living the experience as it's happening.
Yeah. I like how in Kent State, you're largely following the stories of like students who were involved, or at least on campus during the protest or the shooting. And you don't really know who the characters are who are going to be the ones who get shot until it happens. But then you go back and you see how well Backdurf like tells their stories and why they were on campus that day, and how not all of them were even involved in the protest, but they got killed. And he just really made like the entire experience real. Like he really narrowed in on individual experiences from people, and from like people from like different with different perspectives. There was even one or two people like who were part of the police, and you can see like how the police were reacting at the time, and like the doubts that they had about what was going on, questioning things. And then Backdurf also drops in like the political influences of like the local like the mayor and the governor and the police chiefs, how there were like multiple different police groups that weren't really communicating with one another, and like how it was just like chaos. And he did such a good job at like breaking down the pieces of what contributed to this.
Yeah. I mean, because it's more than just that one day. I mean, several days leading up to it, and so when you're familiar with what happened at Kent State, but again, it feels abstract because it feels like it was a long time ago and you just know the statistics, to actually have that sort of personal connection.
Right.
And when it unfolds, that last few pages where actually it is happening, it's kind of chilling. Because again, it's something that happened, and I've seen, the photographs of it, to have it illustrated in a way. And Backdurf's artwork, it looks very sort of like simple and kind of cartoony, but
especially the faces. I can't get into the faces, but his settings and his fashions, the 1970s fashions that he like put the time into, those are really good.
Yeah. It's almost like it's jarring because it is such a serious, obviously violent moment, and it's jarring to see that illustrated that way. It's the same thing, he also did the My Friend Dahmer, which is kind of a similar thing, where it's like it's such a dark subject matter illustrated in this way with tons of back material, that all the research he did when it put into it. So he's not taking these things lightly. He spent years interviewing Kent State survivors and the people involved just to get the full story out there. It's a tremendous book. And again, not a light subject to read. It's kind of a tough book at times, especially with, police violence and, shootings. But I think it's a remarkable book. One last book I wanted to mention on my list, kind of like a very personal take on war and violence, is Onwards Towards Our Noble Deaths by Shigeru Mizuki. This is a manga that was originally published back in 1973. It was translated and published in America, I think in 2009 or so. And Shigeru Mizuki is sort of famous for making the yokai stories and manga popular in Japan. And he's one of the very early sort of big manga artists after World War II. And he served in World War II in the Japanese army. And this is his personal experience of what happened. He was part of a group of soldiers that were basically sent on a kamikaze mission. And they survived, like they didn't die, but it had already been reported to the empire and to the media in Japan that they had sacrificed for the glory of the empire, So they basically send them back out and like, hey, go back out there and don't come back. They basically forced them to go on a kamikaze mission. And it's a pretty heavy book, obviously. All the content warnings but it's interesting because Mizuki doesn't really, he just tells it very factually. It's not like this is what I went through and it was wrong, but like that's what I experienced. It is very sort of even keel, like very open. It's not flattering. It is not showing this glorious sacrifice that these soldiers made. It's just the reality of being in the Japanese army at that time. It's a tremendous book, and Mizuki's artwork is really interesting because the actual like characters are drawn in a very sort of cartoony old manga style, but the backgrounds that they're in are all beautifully illustrated. Just these lush pictures of the jungle that they're in, and also the stark violence that they're experiencing. It's all beautifully illustrated. Meanwhile, the characters themselves are very sort of cartoony and bumbling most of the time. Mizuki does, show the leaders of the group in pretty bad light, obviously, since they're the ones making these terrible decisions. But in terms of a graphic, autobiographical story about war, it's one of the best ones I've read. So it's a pretty famous one. Any other recommendations here for the crew?
I'm nearly certain that as soon as we sign off, I'll think of like 4 more. But I feel like this has been a pretty good sampling of like what journalism can do in comics. And hopefully we've encouraged some of our listeners to pick some of these up. I know that I will probably pick up some of the ones that you guys mentioned. So
I know, my to-read list just got a lot longer.
I will throw out there that a lot of these are also on Hoopla if you partake of the digital comics, that a lot of Joe Sacco, and I know Invisible Wounds is also on Hoopla, even if you're your local library, because they are very expensive to pick up. A lot of these are OGNs that are quite beefy, so they are not a low buy-in cost.
Thanks for reminding me of the Joe Sacco stuff, Kate, because that's a name I've known for years, but I've never really I've read a few pages here and there, but actually I have to go pick up these books. I think I've seen them all at the library. So
same.
That's next on my list.
He tours giving academic talks at universities about comics and how specifically using comics as a form of journalism. And so that was when I first heard of him, was when he came and spoke at U of M, which U of M has a talk series that is open to the public. And I was visiting my aunt and uncle and listened to this, and I had never heard of this guy before and what he did, but it was completely fascinating.
Nice.
And also just like, I will never understand any of the journalists or journalist adjacent people that spend their lives going into active war zones. That is just terrifying to me. Like, you guys are crazy, but I'm glad someone does it,
I think that's the theme here for this topic is, I think the dedication it takes to not only do the research and put yourself in danger at times, or to just, reflect personally on your own experiences in an open and honest way and put it out there in a comic is something really special. And I think that's why, for the most part, these types of graphic novels work better for this material than just to read it on a page. I think you get a more personal take on that stuff. So we got a whole list here. I'm sure the listeners might have recommendations for us. So, and we might have to do a follow-up where we, because after we end this episode, we'll think of more. So
part 2.
Well, cool. I'm glad. Hopefully, we've enlightened some people, encouraged them to maybe step outside and their comfort zone, try these kind of comics. There's a no shortage of good ones out there, as we discussed. So thanks again for the recommendations. Next week, Mike will be back finally with Tia and a mystery guest. We'll see. Who knows? Until then, you can check us out on Instagram, Threads, TikTok, Discord, Goodreads, and YouTube, all at IRCB Podcast. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB Podcast. Bonus audio up there all the time, so go check that out. Infinity Shred is the best band in the known universe, and they do all the music for all of our shows. Xander is your buddy, your pal, and every member of your family. I want to say thank you to Kait and Kate for joining me again. Thank you to Mike for letting me keep the host chair warm this week. Thank you to Danny for doing the proof listening, and thank you for listening. Until next time, comics are good, and so are you.